Good afternoon, colleagues. My name is Tawanda Makusha. I'm from the Human Sciences Research Council. I'm based in the Durban office, and I'm a co-author on the State of South African Fathers Report 2021. I would like to welcome you all to this virtual launch today of the report, and we're looking forward to your inputs, to your contributions and everything that we look forward to. To begin the process, I would like to give this opportunity to introduce Micah, who is Chief Child Protection Officer, Child Protection at Unicef, to give us a welcome message from Unicef. Thank you. Over to you, Micah.
Thank you so much, Tawanda. And good afternoon, everyone. It's a great pleasure and honor for Unicef to be here. And we are grateful for the organizers to give us the privilege of being part of this launch of the second State of South Africa's Fathers Report on this virtual platform. So Unicef South Africa has been on quite a journey with Sonke Gender Justice, for which we are very grateful, and mainly around the Men Care program in scaling it up to reach mothers and fathers in care across South Africa. The Men Care program has shown evidence that fatherhood is important. Through our work, we have found promising results in terms of the role fathers play in the program in addressing intimate partner violence and violence against children, as well as increased involvement in the care of children. So COVID has lifted a lot of concerns as we do, as a consequence of the mitigation measures that the state had to make with the consequent lockdown and so on. But one of these came to the fore was mental health issues that children face of anxiety, distress as a public health concern. So UNICEF recently launched the State of the World's Children report on my mind, promoting, protecting and caring for children's mental health. This report has highlighted that mental health conditions and the lack of caring responses cause significant suffering for children and young people and are top cause of death, this disease and disability. In South Africa and in the region, children live in fluent care and household arrangements, with most children in South Africa who live with men in extended families, which has increased from 48 to 61%, as this report has found out. But coming back to the mental health concerns of children, this also calls for increased matters of improved childcare arrangements, like men care support programs, parenting support programs, as to provide protective factors and enabled through positive peer networks, improvements in family connections, reductions in intimate partner violence, in violence against children, and as to improve positive parenting practices. All these changes do take time. The series of the State of the South African Father reports have shown that the needle is moving. And however, to see the effects of men in care, there is a need for multiple interventions. And these include investment in parental leave policies to be implemented by employers, accessibility to childcare, and flexibility at work that enables parents and primary caregivers to have time to spend with children and to provide nurturing care. In support of children and young people, UNICEF South Africa calls for gender equality, women and girls, boys and men, everywhere, to have equal rights and opportunities and to be able to live free from violence and discrimination. To strengthen the overall child rights governance system with a family-centered approach, and to increase the accelerated investment in prevention and early intervention services as to provide a nurturing care environment, and to provide a whole of society approach to prevention, promotion, and care. It will be further important to integrate scaled up evidence-based interventions across sectors, including gender equitable positive parenting programs. We need to break the silence, address stigma, and promote better understanding of mental health and the experience of children and young people. It is in this context that I would like to welcome you all to the launch of the 21st SOSAF report and having the important conversation around fatherhood and men's involvement in the care and for the realization of every child's rights. I thank you very much. Have a lovely afternoon and looking forward to a rich dialogue. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Micah. Such a pleasure. Thank you so much. Without wasting enough more of your time, colleagues, I'll hand over to Masana Mlaudzi, who is the Director of Programs at Sonke Gender Justice, to give us a message from Sonke. Over to you, Masana. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for this opportunity and for having me in the space, Tawanda, and your curatorship of our time together. I just want to foreground for the purposes of this discussion, welcoming everyone on behalf of Sonke Gender Justice to the launch of the seminal piece of work. As we know, over the past few years, there's been a lot of engagement in the feminist movement around why the emphasis on work with men and boys, oftentimes for the purposes of challenging and interrogating collectively the feminist impetus for this work. So ahead of 16 days of activism under the theme of Orange the World, we are reminded that gender inequality and gender-based violence continue to plague our societies. I'm sure that many of the colleagues on this call based in South Africa have seen that over the past year, 10,000 cases of rape were opened at police stations. We heard news just this week that over 600 girls aged between 9 and 10 gave birth in 2020. Furthermore, between 25% and 40% of South African women have experienced intimate partner violence in their lifetime. In the same breath that gender-based violence and gender discrimination is a societal matter, is an interpersonal matter, we are reminded that our inability to respond is also part of a policy and practice matter. When we looked at the advent of COVID-19 in the last year and the lack of consideration and terms for domestic workers and informal workers, recognizing the majority of these to be Black women and Black women who are migrants in particular, that at the heart of this work is also that women, in particular Black women, are most likely to be unemployed or underemployed or employed in the informal sector. That our provisions for care work continue to disadvantage both men and women from the opportunities of showing up in the home, but especially for the latter. And this in and of itself is informed by patriarchy, the norms and values that underpin gender inequality and gender-based violence in the home and at work. We must ask and continue to ask and question the feminist impetus for our work on engaging with men and boys. How then do we design programs and studies and opportunities for learning about what effectively works for engaging men in the space of care, in the space of home, if we do not understand and we do not research this piece of work? The departure point for the state of South African fathers, much like that of the state of Ugandan fathers and the state of the world fathers reports, is therefore a feminist point of departure. How to engage men for the realization of gender equality underpins the heart that we must be mindful that gender norms and values are harmful to men in their diversity, women in their diversity, and children in their diversity, living in societies, under policy frameworks, in interpersonal relationships, and engaging in institutions and more bodies that place greater value on the cis-het masculine normative frameworks that continue to disregard the diversity of experiences within the home and society at large. Dismantling the hold of patriarchy on caregiving in particular is at the heart of the seminal research. How, as we are implementing a gender transformative approach, to address harmful norms? Are our institutions and policies creating barriers for effective engagement for men in the home, in their diversity? When you read the report, you'll see in Karabo Oza's opening address that they highlight the Concord judgment that disallowed unmarried fathers to register births of their children, as per the Birth and Death Registration Act, in and of itself an indication not just of the unconstitutionality of that clause, but more specifically of the embedded patriarchal norms that lie within our policy frameworks. Of course, fatherhood and the role of men in caregiving must too be decolonized to exist outside of the cishet, gender normative married couples framing that does not govern reality as we have witnessed. If the report finds that 78% of children engaged in the study live with men, more must be asked about the nature of non-father caregiving in this context. Indeed, men in all their diversity must be seen and committed to care for the instilling and practice of gender equality for the young, watchful eyes still developing their norms. Furthermore, they must be seen and committed to care for the liberation of women in their diversity and men in their diversity themselves from the harmful nooses of toxic, violent patriarchy that grips us as a nation. Indeed, the small policy gains in parental leave demonstrate the necessary policy shifts for such emancipation to occur. In alignment with the National Strategic Plan on Gender-Based Violence under Pillar 2 of Prevention and Rebuilding Social Cohesion are the expressed indicators of targeting men in their roles as fathers, and I would add as caregivers. Specifically, the indicators devoted to developing and supporting parenting programs to equip mothers and fathers, adding in caregivers with non-violent and gender transformative skills and communication. Programs like Men Care begin to frame and implement the transformative changes that need to be deeply embedded within our government interventions led by the Department of Social Development. For this to work, and to be grounded and to be successful, it must be scaled and co-owned by government entities. We must move beyond the reliance on civil society for leading this work. And we look forward to hearing from institutions and bodies like Stats SA, the Department of Social Development, the Department of Women, and many others on how they intend to ensure that the gains and the findings from this report are implemented as we move forward into a new dispensation. For now, we commend the organizations and researchers at Sonke, at HSRC, at Stellenbosch University, and the donors such as Unicef South Africa, Oak Foundation, and DG Murray Trust that have allowed us to deepen our knowledge on the role of men in playing a caregiving and active role in society. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to the discussions today.
Thank you so much, Masana. Thank you so much. Much appreciated. Right now, I then hand over to Vessel and Professor Ratele. This is for the overview of the report. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Tawanda, and thank you, Micah, for the welcoming message from UNICEF. And Masana, I think you've actually completed the webinar. We can close. You've said it all. I'm not sure there's much more to say. So I almost feel like I want to just say thank you, everybody. That was it. Goodbye. But thank you so much for the very, very powerful messages from you, Micah, and from you, Masana. So friends, I'm going to share an overview of the report, and I'll talk about the aim of the report series, the national statistics on fatherhood that we documented from broader population studies like the General Household Survey. We also are very excited to share in the report, and today the first results from the first survey that we did for this series of reports. This was a dedicated survey with 1,003 respondents, and it's really exciting because the previous one was more of a scoping review, technically looking at what the research was telling us about fatherhood in South Africa, but we had the good fortune in this round to actually do our own research. Then I'll briefly go through an overview of the substantive chapters that we have in the report. Each report has the format of having a number of chapters that tackle particular topical areas, and embedded in those we have case studies that researchers have produced, and we also added, with the support from the Funza Literacy Trust, a wonderful set of essays written by young people, children, in fact teenagers, about their experiences of fatherhood. The report also gives us a wonderful opportunity to share unheard voices in many spaces, whether it's new and emerging researchers or whether it is the voices of children, for example. Then I'll close with a reflection briefly on the vision and the future of the State of South Africa's Fathers report series. And that will be then the first half of this afternoon together. So let me go into, well, first let me share the aim of the report. And the first one, as you will see in the introduction, is that starting with the report from 2018, the reports aim to produce academic evidence and insights to inform advocacy for law and social reform. So we really want to bring this evidence into the space of making structural changes as far as policy and law reform is concerned in South Africa. But then secondly, we also want to contribute credible arguments that are grounded in the evidence that we are producing or showing to influence the national narratives about fatherhood and fathers in South Africa. Many of the narratives in the media or on social media or in dialogue in small groups is often quite controversial, contentious, sensationalistic, and sometimes it overlooks what the actual reality is at the expense of improving actual father involvement and men's contribution to care. As we will see later on, this report is firmly grounded in Sonke, HSRC, and Stellenbosch University's approach to thinking about social research of this nature. And with Sonke's involvement, we are very happy to locate the work on fatherhood quite firmly in a pro-feminist, feminist, and women's rights orientated framework, as acknowledged and stated in the Constitution of South Africa. I was also really happy, Masana, that you mentioned the other broader frameworks that we are aligned to. In other words, the other national reports on fatherhood, like in Uganda or Tanzania, and of course the regular global report on State of the World's Fathers. All of those are affiliated with the Men Care Global Fatherhood Campaign, which coincidentally today this week we are celebrating 10 years of Men Care. So for those who are familiar with the Men Care Global Fatherhood Campaign, we launched it in November of 2011, and it is a very special moment for me personally to be able to reflect back on a decade of this work of working on getting men more involved in especially unpaid and paid care work. So I also, I don't want to only put the thank you slide at the end. I want to start with the thank you slide, because I do think that the donors of this report, the DG Murray Trust, Unicef South Africa, and the Oak Foundation have really been visionary, and they are stalwart supporters of a progressive engagement with fatherhood involvement or father involvement in not just in South Africa, actually in the region. And I really we are now able to see the changes that this investment is making. So we are seeing a greater upsurge in programming, in greater investment in interventions. We are seeing some changes in policies like the parental leave framework. So there is, as we have reflect back over the last 10 years in South Africa, from the white paper on families in 2012 until now, there's been a slow shift towards a greater acknowledgement of the societal need to support men's engagement in caregiving and father involvement in children's lives. So let me dive into the report. We start first with a quick reflection on some of the national statistics that have been produced by Stats SA, especially on the General Household Survey. Because of COVID, we were hoping to get the 2020 General Household Survey statistics in time for the publication of the report. But Stats SA are still working on those due to the delay in data collection because of the COVID-19 pandemic. So we are referring to GHS 2019, and we are also drawing on other studies like the National Income Dynamics Survey, the COVID Rapid Assessment module, the NIDS-CRAM study from UCT, and the South African Social Attitude Survey, SASIS, from the HSRC. So this, the numbers that we have on the screen at the moment are often seem quite surprising to people who are interested in fatherhood, that there are more men living with children than one would expect. In the narratives about fatherhood, we often focus only on the absence of biological fathers, but we don't really think about the men that children live with. So, and that number has changed. The NIDS-CRAM study, the publication that came out in 2020, showed that there was a movement of men, that more men were moving into households where, especially extended households, where children were living. Before, in 2017, that number was 48%, and then after the first lockdown, it went up to 61%. So, that is likely to be a massive societal shift, that, from 48% of men who live with children to 61% of men who live with children. And then on the other hand, if we think about children who live with men, 41% of children live with men who are not their biological fathers. So you can already see the direction that we are thinking in here, that we acknowledge the biological father's role in caregiving, but we also want to think about the men that children live with or are sharing spaces with, especially in extended families. And the direction that we're going in with the research is to learn more about the interactions, not only between fathers, but also between men that children live with and those who take on the social fatherhood role and identify as social fathers. So as some of you would know, we are now looking at some of the findings about parental leave. So the graph on the left-hand side shows us the results from the South African Social Attitude Survey conducted by the HSRC, which was a survey that asked men and women their opinions about paid parental leave for fathers. And we were very happy to see the 90% of men and 83% of women. So the second graph on the second bar on the graph on the left. So average 86% of men and women who felt that paid leave should be given to the father of a newborn child. Interestingly, there was a skepticism that fathers will use parental leave for reasons that fathers will actually use the leave for parenting. The narrative or the opinion is that, well, fathers will go play golf or go to taverns or go fishing or go on a holiday, but we're giving fathers more time to spend not actually doing what the leave is intended to do. What was really interesting in our survey, however, was that in the sample of 1,003, we had 400 men who answered that they did have paid parental leave. In fact, there was 439 who answered the question about the number of leave days taken. But 400 men answered the question about how they used their parental leave time. And 40% said all of it, and 34% said they used most of it. So it seems like, at least from our sample, this was at least 400 men. Most of them used the time for parenting, which is really encouraging findings. Then the next is a very familiar set of statistics that have often been quoted in this context. I'm not going to go through all the detail. I just want to focus on the right-hand one as a reference, and you will see that the 33% is children who are co-resident with both parents, and 4% are children who are co-resident with the father and not the mother. So that gives us 36% of children who live with their biological father. And if you do a review of all the reports about fatherhood in the last 20 years, that number comes up a lot. That people say, people don't say, we see that the general household statistics has more or less hovered around that number of 36. Sometimes it's 35, some years it's 37, but it's more or less at 1/3 or just over 1/3 of children actually live in the same household as their biological father. But if you unpack that number, what's interesting to see, however, is that if you look at the income groups in South Africa, if you look at the dark brown bars, you will see that a biological father living with a child is quite low in the lowest and second income quintiles, and then that increases as income increases. So in the highest quintile, I've even emphasized it by putting that 69% there twice. In the highest income quintile, that's where children are most likely to live with their fathers. And you'll notice that I'm quite careful to say children living with fathers or fathers living with children, because the two numbers are different. But the GHS data reflects children living with fathers. And then you'll see the other numbers of biological fathers known and not living with child going down. So this is really useful to note. Last year, or it was earlier this year, there was the report that came out on children's wellness, and again there was a lot of national attention on the fact that most black fathers do not live with their children. It was really interesting to note that the media who highlighted that story did not note the same report's finding that of fathers who are employed, 90% live with 90% of fathers who are employed live in the same household as their biological children. So clearly there's a really important relationship between co-residence, income, and employment. And again, the one can focus on the income quintiles as the statistic to tell you about that number, but there's also a provincial dynamic, and there's also, in terms of the imposed racialized categories, there's also an alignment there. So if one looks at this figure number 8, that is breaking it down by race, in the absence of looking at the income graph, you might be mistaken that co-residence is associated mostly with race. It's really important to note that in the history of our country and with the emerging black middle class, there's much more of an association with co-residence than with race, actually. So then the next figure, number 9, is again, it's showing the same. It's showing the high residency in terms of particularly. Sorry, it's by household types. Yes, by race, exactly. So when I started, I began and I said that we are interested in the men that children share households with, and the nuclear family is actually in the minority in South Africa. If you look at the one on the right-hand side, which shows us the total of households in South Africa. So we have nuclear, lone parent, and the majority of households in South Africa are 64% are extended households. So in other words, that means that there are children and not only one parent one adult or two adults, but usually 2 or 3 adults. And again, if one looks at the General Household Survey numbers, where it says a child is living with mother only, that refers quite specifically to which parent is living with the child. It doesn't refer to which are the other adults that share the house with the child. And in South Africa, in the extended care networks that have developed, we really need to develop our consciousness to be able to really understand who the various people are that children share a household and a family with. So the vision of the South African State of South Africa's Fathers Report, we've spoken about co-residence quite a lot now, but this conversation about high involvement of co-resident fathers and low involvement of non-resident fathers is kind of a narrow lens. It's a familiar conversation that we've had many times. However, what we neglect to look at quite often is if you look at the circle on the right-hand side, the non-resident fathers who are highly involved. From what we know, that number is quite low, but indeed we don't know enough about them. There are fathers who are not living in the same house as their children who are involved, and we haven't got at least a representative sample study yet of that. There was wonderful work done again from the NIDSCRAM study by Hatch and Posel on the involvement of non-resident fathers, or in fact the question was who cares for children, and they did have some findings on the financial support especially that non-resident fathers provide to children, but we have much more to learn about that population. And then of course there is the top right hand of the picture, which is co-resident fathers who are not involved. So in the language that has often been used, emotionally or practically absent. So the fact that there is a father in the house doesn't mean much more than the fact that there is a father in the house. What means much more to children's outcomes is the involvement of the father. And that involvement could be a father who's in the house or who is living outside of the house. So this is the lens that we hope to craft as we go forward, so that we don't only focus on the co-resident high involved and the non-resident low involved, but that we also consider those fathers who live separately but are highly involved, and those who live in the household and who are not as involved as we would want them to be. So to go into the State of South Africa's Fathers 2021 survey, this was commissioned by the report team, and we had a company, Kantar Development, who have significant experience in conducting quite rigorous quantitative surveys. They conducted the survey. The sample was a number of 1,003 connected male respondents. Kantar actually reached over 6,000 respondents, but when they screened out validated responses, it came down to 1,003 male respondents. The next State of South Africa's Fathers Report in 2024, we hope that we would be able to have collateral from mothers. So we don't only want to ask the questions of father involvement of fathers, but we also want to ask mothers, and in a safe child participatory way also ask children what they think about these questions that we in this round have only asked fathers. It is a gap, and that gap hopefully will be filled, budget allowing. So any donors who are listening, please help us to develop a more comprehensive lens on what is going on here. We also want to ask mothers and children. So this slide is just telling us about the sample, their age, the provinces that they were from, the race groupings that they represent, and the socioeconomic measure ranking. The SEMs are similar to what is it called? LSM, so lifestyle measurement, I think, is it LSM? So basically income groupings or socioeconomic categories. And this was a sample that responded via mobile devices, so it is a connected sample. So that already tells you about the sample being of means to be able to respond over a mobile device. Then the next one is, as I was talking about the involvement of non-resident fathers, you will see here on the left-hand side the question we asked about frequency of contact with the child who lives elsewhere. And it was really exciting to see that of the 270 fathers who do not share a residence with their child, the twice a week was about 20%, and every 2 weeks was 15%. So there was, at least amongst this group of 270 respondents, quite a high rate of interaction. The reasons that fathers did not see their children, we only had 30 respond to that question, and most of them, or half of them, 50% of that group, so 15 of those fathers said it is because they live too far. And then the next one down, 27%, so that's about 7 fathers, or 6 or 7 fathers said that they were prevented by the child's mother. We do go into a case study that shows the experience of deliberate distancing of fathers from children, and we also provide a case study that is in a different chapter that speaks about the dealing with the conflicts of managing custody and maintenance. Fatherhood is not only about managing the relationships in a household, but it's also it's also, at least from a gender equality perspective, it's really important to think about how do we manage quite contested, conflictual relationships of those two kinds. And I'm not comparing them, I'm not combining them, they are two different instances, but I think they do represent instances of conflictual co-parenting that we do need to grapple with in order to improve outcomes for children and for parents, to be frank. So in this one, we've got questions about health, and there's a frequency of accompanying the partner. Most said that they accompanied their partner a few times to health facilities during pregnancy. And then as we also reflect on father's own health, we saw that 30% of the respondents went for checkups on their own health more than twice a year. Unfortunately, it's still way too low. Men taking care of their own health, it's a familiar trend in a variety of spaces that we need to improve upon. For men's own health, but also for their partner's health and children's health in various contexts. Over here, I'm not going to go through all of these. You can read about this in the report, but I'm just going to pick out. This was an attitudinal set of questions about the respondents' attitudes to certain statements. So the first one that I'm going to point out is that 83% of the respondents felt that a man can be a good father even if he does not live with his children. Once again, that's really encouraging. 77% said that men are as good caregivers as women. And just on that point, this is so contained in the social norms around caregiving, or it is so influenced by the social norms around caregiving. But besides pregnancy and breastfeeding, there is nothing biological that limits men from being as good caregivers as mothers are. I was once in a father's group where we were talking about caring for a child, and a father said, "My partner instinctively knows how to change a nappy." And he was adamant that it's a natural, embedded biological function that she has, that she just knows how to change diapers. And of course it's not. In fact, a set of recent studies, this is reflected actually in the State of the World's Fathers in 2015 already. A set of studies already show that men's caregiving is as good as women's caregiving is beyond the biological functions of pregnancy and breastfeeding. So then the next one is this one over here. I apologize if it's too small, but we have a chapter on non-normative fatherhood, or disrupting the stereotypes around fatherhood, where Professor Malusi Langa and Lynn Goldschmidt worked on a set of studies. And over here we had 43% of the respondents agree that a man who is in prison can be a good father. And then the final one that I want to point out was a negative question. So the response was actually quite positive. The question or the statement said it is not appropriate for men to be preschool teachers, and only 27% of respondents agreed. In other words, 73% of the respondents agreed that it is appropriate for men to be preschool teachers. And this is, of course, a direction that could be a potential policy investment direction for normalizing men's caregiving, for exposing children to nurturing, caring, trustworthy men, especially in foundation phase, in early childhood development, in ECD, ECCE contexts. That is one strategy that we could advise to policy makers that could, in addition to the policy measures outside the education system, support normalizing of men's care. So I'm going to speed up a little bit, and I'm not going to talk much about these chapters because we have some authors after the brief break that we're going to have at 3 o'clock. We are going to ask some of the authors to talk through this. So this is the first substantive chapter after the introduction on father connections and disconnections. And we'll come back to these. There's some findings here on the activities that biological fathers who are biologically related to children do versus men who are acting as social fathers do with children. Again, I feel really encouraged by the high involvement of men who are not biologically related to children that they care for. Then we'll have Dr. Elena Moore present on the chapter on the broad term of social fatherhood, but I'll let Elena go into that in detail when we come back to that. And this is a really interesting diagram that we'll reflect on in a moment. So I think what I'm doing now is I'm giving you a bit of a trailer of I'm doing it's not quite the prequel. I'm doing the trailer before the main event after the break. So again, Mandisa, Dr. Malinga will present for us the input on the economic provision and fatherhood. I'm not going to go into that. And yeah, just to say here, just to pause here for a moment, we did see that finding that a high number of the respondents in the survey felt that a man who is in prison can still be a good father. In the State of South Africa's Fathers Report 2018, we pointed out that the nuclear family, co-resident, heterosexual model of fatherhood is not representative of the majority of families in South Africa, and that there are a whole range of caregiving arrangements and a whole range of positionings of fatherhood that we have not given sufficient attention to. Yesterday at the launch, where we had our in-person seminar, I heard of another one that we actually could spend a bit more time on, which is that the status of fathers whose partners have passed away, who are left being single fathers, but because of the partner passing away. We have some content here in the study on single fathers, on some fathers who had that experience. But this chapter also delves into the experiences of teenage fathers, the experiences of fathers who identify as gay, and also incarcerated fathers. And it was really powerful to hear and to read this chapter and to hear about the powerful intention and engagement with interest and intention on father involvement that fathers had who are in whether it's in social norms or in their physical location, might be constrained in some ways in being able to engage as much in father involvement as they would want to. So just a quick reflection on some of the findings about these topics that we asked the respondents to respond to. So the first one is the survey participants' perceptions of incarcerated fathers. So of the respondents, we had those 2 points, that a man who is in prison can be a good father, 43%, which we've already looked at, and then related to that, a man can be a good father even if he does not live with his child or his children. That was what the respondents responded to those statements. Then we also saw the question about men as caregivers and single men as good fathers, that 91% of the respondents, 908 men, responded that men can be as good caregivers as women, and 77% responded that a single man can be a good father. And then in terms of gay men who identify as fathers, or fathers who identify as gay, we had the overwhelming majority, 56%, compared to the other groups. It's still quite low, but it's the largest group agreed that a gay man can be a good father. So as far as the opinions and the responses from this sample goes, and as much as we can learn from them, the self-reported responses seem quite encouraging. And then the next chapter on fatherhood and violence by Prof. Kopano Ratele. I'm not sure, Kopano, you will be hosting the author panel, so I'm not sure if you want to say something about your chapter now. Sorry, I'm putting you a bit off the spot. We didn't talk about this beforehand. Do you want to talk about your slides, or do you want to join the author panel that you are hosting? How should we do this?
No. I think you should get through this vessel, and if there is space at the end when we have questions, I will take questions.
Sure.
Say a little bit. Yeah.
Thanks, Kopano. So, of course, we know that South Africa and South African society has high levels of violence, and what this chapter looks at is trying to understand the relationship between fatherhood and violence, both the experience of violence, but also the use of violence. And again, highlighting the somewhat contentious point that men are often or in fact, most victims of violence are men in South Africa. But it's, and it's really important to note that men are victims of the violence used by other men. So the one statistic, or the one graph that's quite jarring, is this one in that chapter, that shows us the murder cases in South Africa from 2006 to 2020, and you'll see them going down to 2012 there, and then since 2013 just rising, and if we extrapolate from that curve, still rising. And Kopano was saying yesterday that you've been doing your best to understand what lies behind this. And yeah, I think also we can read in the chapter the analysis of that. Then 3 other questions about use or experience of violence. So this report tells us at this point about the frequencies of responses. So in other words, we didn't yet delve into a deep quantitative analysis where we do statistical associations between different responses to different questions from the same people. So, for example, this question about experiencing physical punishment, so being hit or beaten by a parent using a belt, spoon, stick, shoe, or other implement, and using corporal punishment or hitting a child, so hitting or beating, etc., etc. The experience of respondents who answered this question, 54% had experienced that, and 14% had responded that they have used physical punishment or corporal punishment to their children. So, there's one of the questions that we will delve into when we do the statistical analysis is whether that tells us anything about the intergenerational transfer of violence that many of us are quite familiar with in terms of the literature about this topic. And then the experience of intimate partner violence. Most of the respondents admitted to verbally abusing, to using verbal abuse. So, in other words, the top frequencies were about verbal abuse. So either being the recipient or the user of, and we did also see some use of violence in terms of physical violence from some of the respondents, admittedly a smaller amount. And then Tawanda, Dr. Makusha, also the co-editor and today our program director, led with Professor Ratela on a chapter on the mental health of fathers and the importance of providing mental health care services to fathers. Literature and evidence from the field on the various factors that lead to depression amongst fathers, also looking at antenatal or postnatal paternal depression, and as an emerging field of study, and also thinking about ways to avoid or mitigate that. In our survey, we did ask the respondents about their experiences in terms of mental health or their feelings around mental health, and 48%, so that's 481 of the men who responded to the survey, said that in the last 6 months they had felt down, depressed, or hopeless. And you'll see the answers to the rest of the questions going down there in terms of standardized questions about depression. So that's an overview of the report, and I'm going to pause here and pass over to the program director, to Tawanda. Tawanda, that's it from me. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Yeah, thanks, Vessel. Thanks, colleagues. Can we just take a 5 minutes stretch break? Then we will then come back at exactly 3 o'clock. Thanks, colleagues.
Thanks, Tawanda. And just before we break, just to say that I think we're making quite good time, so we can open up for questions and answers towards the end. And we'll open up for questions and answers about all of the presentations, about anything about the report towards the end. So thanks so much for that. See you at 3 o'clock.
Hello, colleagues. Welcome back. We are going to move straight into our author panel. We're going to start with Professor Elmin Lelch. Over to you, Elmin.
Thanks, Tawanda. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to speak on the chapter Father Connections and Disconnections. And I want to flag that this is a chapter on which quite a number of people worked. 9 authors in all, and then also 4 authors that contributed to the 2 case studies that we have in this particular chapter. So, and I noticed 2 of the other authors here, Razia, Nordine, Lagardine, and Helena. No, it's nice to see you guys here. So this particular chapter should be seen against the backdrop of research indicating that positive father engagement in the daily caregiving of children and fathers having close relationships with children not only benefit children, but also benefit mothers of children, but also fathers. And furthermore, fathers being involved in this way, and this is something I think Wessel also flagged when he talked, is that fathers being involved in these daily caregiving activities and also providing emotional care for children can play an important role in challenging and reconstructing harmful and limiting masculinity and fatherhood ideas. Because it is well known that traditional and harmful gender ideas are most persistent in these private spaces of families. In South Africa, however, fathers are often seen mainly as material providers and secondary caregivers to women or mothers. And although some smaller studies indicate that father involvement often extends beyond this role to include nurturing and emotionally expressive care, there is also then some indication that this may coexist next to more traditional ideas of father's role when it comes to child rearing. So in the first state of South Africa's report, it was highlighted that we need more information about the diversity of fathers and father involvement in South Africa. And this chapter speak to that call. So the first part of the chapter focuses on studies in which interviews were conducted with a diversity of men. In the first study, young men living with HIV, then working class men who live on the Cape Flats, and men from different racial backgrounds in KwaZulu-Natal. And what these 3 qualitative studies tell us is that when men were asked about how they viewed fatherhood, what kind of fathers they wanted to be, and what their involvement were in their children's lives for those men who were already fathers, they said they want to be responsible fathers who are closely involved in their children's lives. So although these men continue to prioritize material care of children, financial care, they also talked about emotional care for children. And again, as the survey highlighted, they reported that they engaged with their children in a variety of activities. Interestingly, and this is something that's also been flagged in other studies, is that these men link their own desire to be involved in nurturing fathers to their own experiences as children, where many of them often longed for more connected relationships with their father. So their own experience an important role in prompting them to be better fathers than the fathers they themselves had. So as I highlighted then at the beginning, although these are small studies, we need larger scale data. These findings are encouraging as they indicate that there's an expansion of roles when men talk about their roles as fathers. In the second part of the chapter, we focus on the other side of the coin, and that is men who struggle to develop and maintain close bonds with their children. And biological fathers who do not live with their children are one such group that often experience challenges in this regard. So in the first study here, various family members of biological fathers who do not live with their children were interviewed about why there was such limited and infrequent contact between fathers and children. And the interesting finding that is foregrounded in this chapter is that although there was conflict, often between parents, and resentment, that they did agree that even if fathers did not contribute financially or could not contribute financially, they still had a role to play in their child's lives by being interested, by being involved. So the sad aspect here is that here is then an important potential resource, families agreeing that fathers have a role, but that it did not result in more frequent and consistent contact between fathers, and in this case, they had adolescent children. And so when we further investigated why then the infrequent contact, it seemed that family members were holding each other responsible for making that happen. Mothers and children felt that it was the fathers who should enthusiastically drive this process, that they should show their keenness to see their children, to be involved with them. And on the other hand, fathers felt that they didn't want to intrude, they didn't want to impose, and they were waiting on mothers and their older children to invite them, to let them know that they wanted. In the chapter then we move on to something that's closely related, and that is when separated parents' relationships are conflictual. And I think take-home message from that particular study is that mediation can be helpful in not only resolving challenges regarding father-child contact when mothers and fathers were in conflict, but it can also assist in strengthening family relationships. So the proposal then is that accessible and culture-appropriate mediation services should be made available, and especially for non-married parents, because you would know that non-married parents aren't compelled, such as legally divorcing parents, to have a parenting plan and to have thought about how children will still have contact with both parents. So it's then specifically in the realm of non-married parents. Thank you, Tawanda. That is my bit and my overview of the chapter.
Thank you so much, Elmin. Should we move on to Prof. Elena Moore?
Thanks, Tawanda. Thank you. So this chapter, chapter 3 in the report, looks at men who care. And this is really significant given the findings that were alluded to by Vessel earlier in the report, that we see a greater number of men living with children, but we also have to think about the ways in which men care for children who they're not living with, whether as as uncles or as brothers or as grandfathers. And this is what this chapter does. So it looks at men who care and looks at the context in which men care, and particularly the familial context. Now, the reasons why this is important is because if we ask ourselves, why do men care? There are legal obligations to care, so the statutory laws that can be enforced, but force men to care, or state that the men have a responsibility to care for at least their biological children. There's customary law, so kind of normative expectations and obligations to care for and look after and be responsible for wider members of a family. But more important than that is the everyday need for care in our society. So whilst on the one hand we have laws, and on the other hand we may have a cultural ethos of interdependence that shapes why we care, we also have a long historical legacy for the need for care, given the levels of poverty and unemployment in the country, and the way in which poverty was socially engineered through colonialism and apartheid. So there's this both historical need, but also the current need to care for children, given, for example, the way in which the welfare state, social grants, for example, are configured. And despite the current moment, a large absence of any social grants for able-bodied working age men and women, and men specifically. So what we did in the chapter is we looked at the ways men care for children and others, and looked at the kind of flows of support in households, both within a household, but also, and more importantly, across households. As we know, men are connected to many children and many others in their wider kin who are living in different places. Now, one of the survey findings that I think is important that popped up was the item that questioned the respondents, that asked, what makes a man a father? So how do we understand fathering from the participants' perspectives? Now, 55% of the participants, or the respondents, said caring, the act and the practice of caring, makes a man a father, compared to only under a third of participants, so 32% of participants said pregnancy. So being a biological father makes a man a father. What was quite surprising for me in these findings was that only 13% of men believed that customary rituals and processes that are performed that recognize men as fathers was what made a man a father. Now, I think that we could probably look further into those figures through larger data sets or larger surveys. So Vesa, if we could move on to the example. Thank you. So the example here, if everybody can see this, is one of the cases that I looked at from one of the participants' stories. And so the study that the chapter is largely based on is a study of over 75 households in Cape Town and Johannesburg that looks, as I said, the flows of support within and across households. And this map that you can see on the screen looks at Yanga, one of the participants, his larger kind of extended family. Now, Yanga himself is the dotted triangle kind of in the center. And he's a 41-year-old man who's been employed as a soldier since 2005. Now, he's the second youngest of 4 siblings, and he has 3 biological children, 1 child from a previous relationship and 2 children in his marriage. He lives with his wife, their 2 children, and the wife's child from a previous marriage, who he is providing for and looking after. He financially supports all 4 of those children. Now, if we look though closer, we see that he was also connected to others in his kin network. So all people living within the dotted line were living together in one household, albeit maybe in separate rooms. So in reality, everyone within that dotted wider line that incorporates 7 or 8 people, Yanga is providing for and also providing support for. So the markers in orange indicate the people in his wider kin network that he was supporting financially. Now, one thing that is important to mention is that Yanga is gainfully employed, earns a particular salary, but after he fulfills all his obligations in caring and providing for many people in his family, he's left with very little at the end of the day. So he actually has quite a precarious level of existence despite being gainfully employed. The chapter goes through 2 or 3 other case studies like this, for both grandfathers, for brothers, and in this case with Yange, he's an uncle. However, it's also supplemented by 2 case studies. I see Mabonisi Nyati is here in the room today, and Mabonisi authored one of the case studies that looks at the ways in which the state shapes who can be seen and who can be recognized as a father. And his work, and maybe in the Q&A we have time for Mabonisi to talk more about his work, but his work looked at fathers who were doing care, actively providing care, but were not recognized by the state, mainly for the reason of being not listed on the birth certificate of their child, of the child's birth certificate. Now we know the recent constitutional court case has ruled such practices out, that fathers now are entitled to and should not be discriminated again by not being able to be listed on the birth register and birth certificate of their child. It was seen as a discriminatory practice against both children and unmarried fathers. The second case study looks at how customary law regulates who can be and who can't be a father. So in this case, we look at Khahisa Mapala, who's doing a PhD study on woman-to-woman marriages and the regulation of biological fathers in such marriages and families. She looked at the ways in which the biological father in that instance has no direct contact with the child per se. So the female husband is, had paid the child price or the bride price or lobola for the child and is seen as the guardian and parent of the child. However, at the same time, she alludes to the various mechanisms in customary law and through various practice where the father, the biological father, can come in contact and can have a relationship with the child, despite not being officially recognized as the father of the child. So we see through these 2 case studies and through the chapter at large, the various ways in which both kin, through normative expectations and what could be also described as customary law kind of expectations, but also through the state and various former ways in which the state regulates men who do provide care, and the ways in which that shapes who can be seen and supported as fathers. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Lena. Now we'll move on to Dr. Mandisa Malinga. Over to you.
Thank you, Tawanda. Hi, everyone, and it's good to see you all again. So I will be speaking to chapter 4, which is titled Economic Provision and Fatherhood. So what this chapter looks at is the constructions of fatherhood among men and the ways in which these constructions are particularly centered on economic provision in relation to how men speak about themselves and their roles as fathers. And also the exclusion of narratives of care work in these conversations. Men do not highlight care work in these conversations. And when they do speak about care work, it comes out as secondary to their most primary role, which is to provide. And I have here just a very brief extract from one of the participants in one of the studies I conducted on fatherhood, Uspikiri, who is a 27-year-old man, speaking about his role as a father. And what Uspikira says here is that you must first make sure that that children eat, my sister. You must make sure that you provide them with clothes to wear, and only then you have to make sure that they get a father's love at all times. So we see how this thinking about nurturing and care and love comes secondary, of course, to the role of providing for their children's economic needs. Of course, also taking into consideration the fact that these men exist in contexts where poverty exists, and they have to, their families are in need of provision. And so what it also speaks to is these contexts, right? How does poverty, how does unemployment, how does engagement in precarious forms of work impact men's engagement with their children and families? For example, if men have to work, go seek work far, spend hours away from the home, to what extent are they able then to actively participate in their children and families' lives? So it also looks at the cultural context within which men exist, which also frame care work as an arena for mothers and women. This is something that mothers are supposed to be doing and not so much men. And we see this, I've seen this come through in a number of studies that I've conducted. And I have here a very short extract from one of the participants that I named Jabu in a previous study I conducted. And here, what Jabu says is that the only thing that I see for a father is to provide for his children. Anything else must be done by the mother. And how he phrases this in his Xhosa, he says, "Enye nenye, maibe ngumama wabo." So my role is basically to essentially provide for my children. And the mothers are then responsible for everything else. And we see how even in the SOSAF survey that was presented earlier, where narratives around men are better, women, mothers are better, women are better parents than fathers. And therefore, this is something that they should be doing. And in the survey, we had 55% of the participants or the respondents basically saying that they agree that women are naturally better mothers, and then only 23% disagreed, and then other participants were, in a sense, neutral. So again, these are narratives that are used to perpetuate, these unequal divisions of labor within the home, where women then end up doing the bulk of the care work, and men are concentrated, or rather focused on providing financial support. And so what this chapter really speaks to is, in thinking about this work that we do with men, promoting active and engaged fatherhood, the extent to which we take into consideration these contexts within which men exist, right? So when we do the workshops with men, when we do the supportive work with men, and then they have to go back into families that don't recognize or this form of actively engaged fathering, where it's not familiar, where the father is expected to be out looking for work, if not actually working, and what that means, and basically highlighting the societal approaches that are needed, thinking through how do we engage mothers, how do we engage the children, and in a way that basically promotes and supports and enables this form of fathering that we're trying to promote among men. And so, yeah, it draws on different forms of data from the SOSAF survey, my own doctoral and postdoctoral work, 2 case studies from 3 of my former students, Mwakwana Mudubi, who was a master's student, who presents a case study on basically the ways in which men's support towards their extended networks, extended family limits what they're able to do within their own families in terms of providing for their families. There's also a second case study from Tama and Nicole, who are honors students, and their case study focused on young student fathers who are in university and trying to balance their role between providing and being present for their children. And what comes through in that particular case study is that young men feel that what they have to do right now, they can't be present and support their children, whether it be providing financial support or even just nurturing, being the presence. They have to focus on their study because they believe that sets them up to be better providers in the future, right? So there's very much a focusing on, if it means I'm sacrificing the time being present right now, but it also means that in the future I'm better able to provide for my children. And so all of these pieces of work, the case study, my own research and the survey points to the significant role that class plays in shaping men's engagement with their children and family, in determining the extent to which men do become involved. Of course, I think Wessel spoke to the data first. We saw quite relatively high levels of engagement with men in this particular survey, which speaks to the social positioning of the men that were interviewed as part of the survey in relation to what we would see when we were interviewing men who are unemployed, men who live in contexts of poverty. So again, class does quite significantly inform the ways in which men are able to participate and engage with their children. But of course, this does not mean that poor men do not want to be present in their children's lives, but it also means that there's so many barriers that they have to face with regards to being actively engage with their children, and also having access to their children for some of them who have to engage in migrant labor, right? Travel far away from their families and children, and therefore not being able to do the nurturing and caring work that we speak to. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Malinga. Now we move on to Felicity Guest. Over to you, Felicity.
Good afternoon. Thank you. Nice to be here again. I'm a social justice activist with a particular focus on financial abuse and economic inequality. It started with my own experience 10 years ago with a fraudulent divorce. And as a result of my horrific and traumatic experience in the maintenance courts, I started a Facebook group 7 years ago, which now has just short of 70,000 members, of which 83% are women who are battling to get financial support for their children. So over the years, I recognized patterns and trends, and my interest in understanding the patterning grew, which eventually evolved into advocacy. And not paying child support is a form of financial abuse towards not only the mother, but to the child as well. I have recently launched my own research to collect data on the prevalence of financial abuse post-relationship. Information from my group over the 7 years is that women feel helpless, abandoned, and neglected by the fathers and the judiciary in the efforts to secure financial support from the fathers. This is complex and needs further research to fully understand the phenomenon of women raising children with little or no financial support and being absent. Mothers resign themselves to fathers being absent, but expect them to at least financially support the children. This, I think, contributes to fathers feeling like ATMs. A few factors that appear to have influenced this and absent fathers are migrant labor and the impact that had on families. The traditional nuclear family has changed. Culture and traditions, interpretation and lack of enforcement of the Maintenance Act. Intimate partner violence, domestic abuse, sexual assault, rape, inherent economic privilege, gender socialization, and gender roles. Studies show that most victims of gender-based violence and intimate partner violence experience a plethora of abuse in relationship, married or not, and up to 98% of victims who leave abusive relationships experience economic abuse, and if they have children, the children become the glue that binds them to the abuser. The abuse does not stop when they leave the relationship, it just changes shape and form. And the most powerful tool post-relationship is money. Financial abuse is a subcategory of economic abuse, which needs further research. South Africa is a traumatized nation with high levels of violence, particularly men on men and men on women. We have some of the highest murder, rape, femicide, sexual abuse, and gender-based violence statistics in the world. So it's not surprising that financial abuse is so prevalent and so normalized. Over 55% of 1,500 women polled on my group received no financial support whatsoever. The high level of conflict post-relationship needs serious focus if we are to change the trajectory of all forms of abuse. What I noticed over the past 7 years on my Facebook group is that women deny access to the child after experiencing one or more of the following. Asking the mother to abort when she announces that she's pregnant, as the father signed up for sex, not fatherhood, whether the man is single or married. And often at the same time, they tell the women that they want nothing to do with the child. The man denies paternity, he does not adhere to culture and accept paternity and pay damages. The mother's family don't recognize him as a father and discourage any contact and to ask for any maintenance. There is a pattern that mothers only approach the courts years later when they are struggling financially. And it seems quite prevalent around the age when children go to school, or another common reason is that the maternal support stops. The father disappears and he reappears later. The father refuses to pay maintenance. The father is physically or emotionally abusive post-relationship or before relationship. The father abuses substances, and the new girlfriend or new wife is abusive towards the mother and the children, and at times threatens to kill or harm the mother and or the children. The Children's Act is clear that rights and responsibilities are separate, yet it does not always take all of these things into account. They definitely influence each other, and I think there needs to be a holistic approach to financial support and care and contact. They can't always be dealt with separately. So financial abuse, in my opinion, is a silent but no less violent form of gender-based violence with an intersection to women's economic inequality and poverty. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Felicity. I'll hand over now to Professor Ratele, who is going to take over from here. Thank you.
Thanks, Tawanda. Thanks for doing this while you're feeling under the weather. So thanks, Felicity, Mandisa, Elena, and Elmine, and Vessel for taking us through the report. I'm going to manage. My job is to manage the questions and answers, and Danya has opened the Q&A, and you can type your questions there and interact with the panelists and with the Vessel. Vessel had indicated that 3 chapters of the report could not be presented today. I'm looking at the chat to see what's been said, so I beg your pardon. Let me just go and see what we have in the chat, if we do have questions. If we don't, while you are thinking about the questions, we can offer Tawanda, if you're still around, and because I know you might be running out of charge, you can take a couple of minutes to present your work. This one person who's asking a question. I'm trying to get to it.
So Leo, I think that's you. You also logged into the Sonke account. Maybe since we're still waiting for typed questions to go into the chat, Prof. Ratele, maybe we can pass to Leo. Leo, are you able to unmute yourself?
Thank you very much, Vessel.
Thanks.
Thank you much, Vessel. I hope you could hear me. And greeting to everyone in this Friday afternoon. My question goes to Elena Moore. And my question is basically, what are some of the positive aspects have you picked up from your study in relation to cultural norms, in relation to fatherhood and responsibility? I'm interested to see if there are any positive aspects in relation to the cultural norms associated with lobola or associated with more responsibilities for men to commit in particular, not for men to have children all over the show. And then after that, they demand that their children will come to them at some stage in their lives. And I'm speaking from an aspect of where I was raised myself by a single parent. And then later in my life, my father expected that before I go to initiation school, I will go and ask him his permission. Thank you very much. That was my question.
Thank you so much for the question. as I said at the beginning, I was really taken back by the finding, the survey finding that said that only 13% of men who responded felt that performing customary rituals and practices such as Nkluhlulo, Mbeleko, made a man a father. I would have expected that number to be much higher, much, much higher. I probably need to do a bit of work to see this sampling about where the survey, you know, to think it through it a bit more. But so that's one response. I'm very taken aback by that. The second thing is, however, in the absence of that, so in the actual study, in the chapter that looks at what do men actually do rather than what do they not do, I could see that the cultural expectations and normative expectations of men who are senior or in a family and who are, I suppose, expected to support others who become dependent on them are definitely fulfilling that role and playing and fulfilling very crucial caregiving, both practical and financial roles in that regard. What I should say on the side of that is we've conducted other work that looks specifically, it's not in this chapter per se, but it looks at how Nkluhlulo, as you know, acts as a mechanism for bringing families together, for recognizing the biological father, process that may unlock relations between families, that may facilitate greater father involvement potentially, albeit we know that much of the literature that talks about this talks about the kind of financial aspects of what kind of acts as a barrier for many men to performing the customary practice and for getting closer maybe to the child and to the maternal family. So in our research, we looked at people and men who were employed, who did perform Nkluhlulo and who did have an ongoing relationship with the child. Now, I think what is needed is very balanced research that looks from multiple perspectives, from the mother's perspective, from maternal kin, elders and maternal kin, elders and paternal kin families, and the father's perspective, about how these negotiations, when they can take place, because we know the financial kind of consequences that can happen when people are not employed and don't have the money to necessarily perform or at least fulfill some of these cultural practices. But what we were seeing is that it definitely shaped the ways in which fathering was being, and men were being involved in practices of respect, practices of being patient, practices of being flexible with regards to their child and the maternal family, and very much practices that spoke to highly kind of positive relations between mothers and the maternal kin, and also fathers and paternal kin. So I think what's needed here is far more emphasis on how such cultural practices and how they're undertaken can shape very meaningful relationships with children, but also between families, rather than seeing them as barriers based on financial exclusion and people's inability to pursue them. What also the research showed, and this is the last point I'll make, is that such practices and were up for negotiation. So many people who performed the practice spoke about the flexible ways in which payment, and I don't want to say payment, was negotiated. So that even men who were unable to meet a specific kind of payment were given more flexible options about how it could be met. Maybe a certain sum was paid up front, and then down the line more could be revisited. So there's kind of 3 or 4 points in response to your question that hopefully give some insight to the question. Thanks.
Thanks, Elena. Vestal, you have questions directed at you, but I'm gonna go through all of them. The questions, one is Ulifile Masang asked about the distinction you made between children living with their fathers and fathers living with their children. What's the difference? Jen Smout asks about the nature of the care. To what extent are we seeing both increasing care if there is increasing care and increasing gender equitable norms. That's questions we've been deliberating about ourselves. And then Lauren told us again about this increase that you indicated in that graphic, whether the 61% this year from under 50% is due to migrant workers returning home to lockdown, or are there other reasons? Probably you will have to speculate, but we also have spoken about this.
Thanks, Kopana, and thank you for the questions. It's nice to see familiar friends in the chat as well. So I think I'll take the first one and the second one. The first one and the third one together. So what you see on the screen at the moment is the page that shows the overlap between children living with men and men living with children. So the difference is that there are most children actually live with men according to the General Household Survey. So for example, if in my household there is one child and I am living with my brother in this house, then there are there are two men living in the house with one child. So in other words, if I am a representative of a group of, let's say, 10 men, then 20% of the men are living with 1% or 10% of the children. So the two are the Venn diagram that we've put over here. And what was interesting, and I think this is in response to the third question, is, and this is not from our data, this is from the NIDS-CRAM study. That was a really, really useful a study, a paper that came out about movements during pandemics. By Doris Posel and colleagues at UCT, is that men who were living in households that were not with children had moved into households with children during the time of the lockdown. So that went up from 48% to the 61% that we can see on the screen. The reasons, Lauren, it's not the research that we did. I think it's worthwhile looking into the NIDS-CRAM paper on that. And to see what it is likely connected to the loss of employment. That would be my speculation or my interpretation of the findings, is that due to loss of employment, men were more likely to return to the extended families that they originated from. And then Jen, I think in terms of your question, I've got two responses which I think are related. The first one is a really important distinction to make. This report that we are launching now is the first of its kind survey. So this is the first time that we are looking at what's happening in terms of fathers' involvement in care with a survey of this nature. We don't have a baseline to compare this to. So we don't know whether fathers' involvement has increased or decreased. All we know is that this is what we found with this sample of men in this time. When we do the next report, we will compare it against this one, and then we could make a conclusion. If we ask the same questions to a similar sample, yes, it has increased or decreased. So the fact that we are finding levels of involvement that were unexpected is encouraging, but it is a static data point. It's not compared to anything in the past. I think that the time used, the surveys that we do get from time to time give a better indication of how those things change over time. And so that's the first part of my response. And I think that's in terms of the media's reporting about this report, and in terms of our thinking about this, we're lifting the carpet, we're lifting the blanket, we're looking at this for the first time. It's not a comparison against the previous report. That's my first response. The second response is that in terms of how caregiving has changed, we've got two reference points in terms of time use data. The first one is the time use survey that Debbie Badlander did in 2010, which was published in 2012 by Stats SA, called A Time Use Survey. And then more recently, of course, UN Women commissioned a time use survey. I think it was also called COVID Rapid Assessment, but it was a different acronym than CRAM. But it's under the UN Women Commission, the set of gender analyses that included time use data analyses. And it's a really, really insightful set of reports to look at. And what we saw in the one about South Africa was that the time that men and women spent on care increased, both categories. So men's caregiving increased, women's caregiving increased in South Africa. The gap between women doing more care work than men remained. So, you know, if men were at 2, they were now at 4. If women were at 4, they were now at 7, actually. So the gap, so the care work increased, both groups did more care work, but what was concerning was, in fact, that the gap even widened. So women were actually doing even more than before in South Africa. In other countries, the gap had closed or the gap had stayed the same. And this is consistent with findings actually internationally outside of even Africa, across the world, in terms of the COVID pandemic. From the State of the World's Fathers, we saw the same, that COVID, you know, pushed men's caregiving up, but the gap between genders remained or worsened in many cases. So I hope that answers. We reflected briefly on that in this report. So I hope that answers the question. Thank you, Kopano.
Thank you, Wessel. Just to add to that, in the violence chapter, there's a case study reported that we did with Rebecca Hellman and Pascal Richardson on another survey, not the source of survey, about gender equitable norms in the home. So we had asked parents, 1,700 plus parents or caregivers about this. And that study is specifically around gender and gender equitable parenting, about toys, about all kinds of things. One of the striking things we found in that study is that 8 in 10, 4 in 5 of South African parents, so quite high numbers, say they support gender equality, or the way we had asked it, that men and women should be treated the same or similarly. And so we have high numbers of that. And you'd want to read about that. And yet, so the question about gender equality in the family is an important one. We haven't quite asked it. We haven't delved into it in the source of survey. I think we'll pick it up in future surveys. But even in the parenting and survey that we did, some interesting findings are evident. Both men and women. I think that's what I guess I wanted to put towards both men and women, but with different frequencies and percentages. Might, on one hand, say that they support the equal treatment of men and women, but when you start asking about who does what and how they think about men and women in the family and gender, you see an interesting picture. For instance, that both men and women, or at least a still rather worrying percentage of both men and women, think girls should do more of the housework, although men think this more than women, that soft toys or dolls, for instance, are meant only for girls and not for boys. That when we ask questions about obedience, and again, kind of worrying that somehow patriarchy. So there are evidence of patriarchal women and men in the survey. So it'd be interesting, if you're interested in that, I guess you can find that in the chapter on violence. Any other questions, please? We still have about 11 minutes.
Kopano, there's a question about policy.
I am going there, Vessel. So this is from Natasha. Based on the findings on this report, I'd be interested to hear from the panel what 2 policy changes they would prioritize in South Africa to try and shift the picture, enable men to be more engaged fathers, whether resident with their children or not. Vessel, I think you received a similar question yesterday in the in-person launch. Do you want to take this, or Elena, Mandisa, Felicity, or Tawanda?
Let's pause to others first, Kopana.
Joan van Niekerk has added, especially in relation to the Children's Act. I think Joan might be connecting with the question in common by Natasha. Felicity?
Just from the work that I do, I think that mediation is a very, very good option, but I think we need to relook the kind of mediation or redefine it specifically for getting two parents to reach a place of understanding that it's in the best interest of not only the child, but them as well. I often say to the parents that you're together, you have to work together for the rest of the child's, until it becomes an adult. And I think that the facilities offered by the Family Advocates Office doesn't go far enough. So without it being adversarial or conflictual, I think we need to look at creating different spaces for parents to come together, which is more educational in terms of understanding our gender roles and socialization, that will shift away from that. So we're not blaming each other, but rather acknowledging how both genders find themselves having to navigate a very patriarchal construct that we all are born into, and to change it from that perspective.
Thank you, Felicity. Anybody else wants to take on the respond?
Thanks,
I see Razia and Nordine Lagadin has answered that the aim of transformative mediation, relation-focused healing relationships. I think connecting with the question, the answer that's been given. Eleanor?
Yeah, so just in relation to the question about two policy suggestions or lines of thought or approaches based on the findings, I think one that I would want to see more broadly in South Africa, at least some thought being given to it, I can't say how it would look, in a polished version, would be the kind of the recognition of the work that men do in providing for or looking after children who are not their own biological children. Now, there is some recognition of that. And as I said, there's some kind of, there are laws that kind of expect that work to be done by related men, whether they're uncles or grandfathers. But I think the reverse is not true. So the expectation is there, where at the same time the kind of support structures or very practical financial, dare I say it, relief, or, I won't say tax relief necessarily, but just relief and support could be better thought through by the South African state. So that's on the one hand what I would like to see with regards to social fathers being recognized for that work, as opposed to just being a kind of an assumption that it'll happen. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, I think in relation to the Children's Act and how they understand who a father is, well, our findings suggest that they're probably, they're aligned to what's stated in the Children's Act. I, on the other hand, think there could be great tension between the Constitutional Court case, the outcome of that, and actually what happens on the ground, particularly in rural areas, but not only in rural areas, about who is seen as and considered a father in relation to unmarried parents or unmarried couples. So I think there's greater need for conversations and for dialogue at state level, government, legal, and kind of academic and advocacy in relation to the way in which cultural norms play out to understand who is a father. So I think there's more work to be done there. I can't say what it will look like, but I think that conversation needs to be had, because I think that will still result in a lot of tension, either by biological fathers or by biological mothers who don't necessarily want the biological father recognized because they don't see them as a legitimate father. Thanks.
Vessel, you want to offer another response? Because Jonathan Nell has asked a question that we want to direct to Mandisa.
Thanks, Kopano. So parenting leave, we've been tracking that. So going towards the vision of shared, equal, or at least equal non-transferable paid parental leave for all parents, including fathers. So equal leave. The second one is firstly, just really investing, as Elena said yesterday, in improving ECD services overall. Reviving the ECD system in South Africa post-COVID or kind of in the context of COVID. But within that context, I think a structural intervention could be emphasis on safe ways to engage male caregivers in the ECD system as paid caregivers. And then the third one is, of course, in the health sector. So thinking about more gender-sensitive norms and standards for mothers and fathers in antenatal health services. I think those three policy dimensions pop out at me. Thank you.
Mandisa and anybody else who wants to take this. Jonathan Nell has asked, how do we reach fathers who experience the double jeopardy of not being able to connect with their children and that are burdened by economic inequalities or poverty and unemployment in our country? I think Elmine also might pick up and respond to this.
Hi, Kopano, thank you for that question. So I think, the first point to engage with is to think about how broadly, at least at the level of society, we understand the concept of care and how we work towards stripping it of its gender bias, right? So this work is accepted and understood as work that men can also do, so that when men are unemployed, they don't have to worry about the fact that I might face shame and humiliation for just being at home and not having a job. So I can contribute to being at home and participating and actually looking after my children. So that concept, we need to do work there, right? With both men and women, of course. And then I think, how we draw men in. And I have experienced that in my own research with men. When you ask men to talk to you about fatherhood, the first thing, at least in the context where my work is located with men who are unemployed, men who engage in precarious forms of work, the first thing they'll tell you is that, Sisi, abantwana bambalampile, right? And you here wanting to talk to me about fatherhood. So thinking about how these multi-dimensional approaches that we need, that it's not just focusing on just, promoting positive fatherhood, but also thinking about these men have real realities of poverty, they need jobs. So in that context, they're not really open to having conversations about positive fathering because there is this primary need that needs to be addressed. And so really, it's not an easy question to answer, right? And so we need to address this work, at least from different perspectives, different angles. And I think in recent conversations with a friend of mine who has been thinking about how we do this work with men on positive fathering. And we've thought about a project with fathers who are day labor workers, but also thinking about bringing gardening, right? Food security, food production into the conversation, because they talk about their children being hungry and being able to provide. And so if we bring gardening, train men how to grow their own food, could that potentially, right, address one part of their problem, but also then if they're at home growing their own food, potentially for their own consumption, but at some point maybe to sell and then create more of an income rather than being on the side of the road for hours every day, could that potentially close this gap where they are at home? And could that be a skill that they transfer to their children? And therefore that space where they do that work means that they're more actively engaging with their children. So we have to really, from just different angles, different perspectives, think about how we do this work, which I don't think can be just really easily solved, particularly because these realities are real. Poverty exists, they're hungry, their children needs school fees and all of those things that they're concerned about.
We'll have Elmine give an answer and then we will close thereafter.
Thanks for the question, Jonathan. Something that I can relate to Mandisa in our own work with fathers and how difficult it is to access them, especially with our work with low-income fathers, where there was tension with the mothers about lack of payment of maintenance or any kind of contribution, that when we did contact fathers, they often thought we were, I think there was some kind of show called Tapgeld, and they thought we were actually on them to try and expose them as people who did not pay it. So their men often have very fears, low-income men who are not able to contribute to their children's care for that reason. But the other encouraging thing for me is about the work, the research that I've done with fathers, is that men are willing to at least come for research interviews if their children ask them to. So I conduct research with family units, with adolescent children and mothers and fathers. And we didn't have much luck trying to access fathers directly. But when we ask children, and children ask fathers to be involved. So I think there is a way that we can get to fathers, because it seems that there is enough care from father's side to, if a child asks him to come for an intervention, that he may well be more open to considering it. Thanks, Kopano.
Thanks, Elmine. We're at the end, and I'm going to ask people at Sonke, particularly Vessel, and then Tawanda to say something if they want to before we close, particularly about the report. The report is available. Please access it and distribute it, share it. We don't have money right now to print new copies, but we hope to have those in the very near future. But you can get a soft copy from Sonke. I want to say maybe three things in summary. One, the question on policy asked by Natasha is a fantastic question. We have received, this is the second time we have had this question, not just policy, but I guess large programmatic interventions, how to shift men towards more engagement. And probably this is a question we have to think about carefully for the future launches of this. So we, I can hear people thinking on their feet, but maybe we don't do enough about it. So this is where we think there are some policy-related recommendations in the report, for instance, around men's mental health, around financial, so economic aspects related to fatherhood and others. So, and then you had the responses from our panelists, but perhaps you want to think about it quite more deeply. Jen asked a question that's important. Before the launch today, some of you will have had the Minister of Police giving the new numbers. It is the most incredible thing every time I hear about it. So basically, one message, if you were listening carefully, the police don't know what to do about violence, mob murders. Literally, the minister could have just as well said, we don't know what to do about this. And he says, South Africa is a violent country. This is the police minister saying this. So basically saying, we don't know what to do with the violence as the police. And it's probably right, because as he said, he was saying that, and we know from research from UNICEF, from the MRC, from ISS, Institute for Security Studies, and from a lot of gender-related work, that part of this counter crimes, assault, GBV, and murder is related to arguments or dispute in the home. So the police can't intervene right there. What this means is in the chapter on violence, for instance, one of the things, well, I say more or less the same sort of things, is if the police don't know what to do with this, if they don't have good explanations, and if the plan itself can't seem to resolve the question of violence, particularly the question of violence of men against other men, the national, I'm talking about the national plan on gender-based violence and femicide. If we don't know, or first of all, we're already in trouble, I think the trouble is not going to go away. Probably what one thinks is to divide part of the problem. Perhaps you don't have to divide it, but we would be happy if we see reductions every year, rather than a plateauing or a going up of the numbers, a reduction. Say we want to move to certain reduction, which the police, by the way, still try to do, because it looks like we must be happy. We should be happy at some point, for now, for the immediate future, to live with the reduction in violence, gender-based violence, rape, assault, rather than thinking about big issues on shifting patriarchy, as the president said in the introduction to the plan. For instance, we want to shift patriarchy, we want to end patriarchy, which I don't think we would be able to. So that's the second part of this. And the last question by Jonathan. Jonathan is asking really important questions around kind of this, if you will, double jeopardy, the way you put it. And Mandy says off at some point. So these 3 points that I take are questions that demand us as the editors, but also the panelists, to think further. I'm leaving now to let Vessel say something about the report and perhaps future launches of the report.
Sure.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Kopano. Thank you. And thank you to the 46 people who are staying with us over 4 o'clock. We appreciate your attention. We don't take it for granted. We are doing a more government and policymaker related launch next year, where we engage especially in the policy related questions with decision makers. And we're really excited about that. The report is online. It's on the Sonke website. It's on our social media, so you can download it for free there. I really want to just thank everybody for the insightful contributions that everybody has made. The vision of the report, I've shared a little bit about it, but just to close on this note that this comes from a project where we are working with children's books that fathers will share with children, and the project has led to this wonderful thing of editing the illustrations to add fathers into the picture. And just to end on the request or the suggestion or the wish that we do not only add fathers to the picture, but that we actually look at the men who are already there and start to see them, so that we can start to engage with them. Thank you, everybody. Have a wonderful weekend, and I really appreciate your attention. Goodbye.
Well done. Thank you so much. It was very interesting.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Vessel. Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Okay, I'm going to close the call and I'll see everybody on the WhatsApp group. Thanks, everyone.
Vessel.
Yes.
Don't go away.
Okay. Let me just pause the recording for those who are watching this after the fact online. Goodbye.